To introduce our presenters, we have Dr. Amy Snover, who is the University Director for the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Amy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Meade Crosby. She is the Senior Scientist here at the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, and she is also the University Deputy Director for the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So I just want to tell you a couple things about Meade. She works closely with land and wildlife managers to collaboratively understand and address climate impacts on species and ecosystems. Her current work includes vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning, large landscape conservation planning for climate resilience, and efforts to build climate adaptation capacity and communities of practice. Dr. Crosby received a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Cornell University and her PhD in Biology from the University of Washington. Take it away, Meade.
Thank you, Amy. And thanks so much, everyone, for calling in today to learn more about our work. You might notice a slight modification to the title of a key word. Probably I left it out when I sent you guys the title, but this one's important. So co-producing tribal resources for climate change vulnerability assessment. And that'll become clear why that word's important as I go along here. So I'm going to talk about a project that we completed last winter, though in some ways it's really ongoing, aimed at enhancing the ability of tribal natural resource managers in the Northwest and the Great Basin to assess climate risks to tribally important natural and cultural resources. Today I'm going to be describing the suite of resources that we produce as part of this project, and I'm also going to be describing the process that we employed to ethically and effectively co-create them with our tribal partners to ensure that they'd be useful and used. So I want to start by acknowledging that this effort was a partnership among university, tribal, and federal entities, including a large team from here, the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, a key team member at University of Idaho, and a tribal advisor group that I'm going to talk about more in a little bit. And it was funded primarily by the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center and the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative, with additional funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. So together, this team developed a suite of resources that were designed to help inform tribal efforts to assess and respond to climate risks to natural and cultural resources. And just a quick overview, these resources include a tribal climate tool. This is an interactive online climate data source, and also a provision of summaries of climate impacts for Northwest and Great Basin tribes, as well as the Tribal Vulnerability Assessment Resources website, which offers a user-friendly online orientation to vulnerability assessment for tribal staff and community members, and also a tribal climate technical support desk. And this offered rapid response to questions from tribal staff about climate change impacts and assessment and response. So these resources were developed as a direct response to work that was completed in 2015 by Don Sampson of AT&I, in which he surveyed Columbia Basin tribes to assess their capacity to respond to climate change. And what he found was that there were significant disparities among tribes in their capacity for climate change response, with some tribes making significant progress and others having difficulty just getting started. His work was funded by the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center to help identify areas where the center could support tribal capacity for adaptation. And of the barriers to preparedness that Don identified, some, such as social or political barriers, the CASC really could do little about, but one in particular, which are the gaps in technical capacity for vulnerability assessment in some tribes, the CASC could do something about. So the project was initiated in response to an identified need among tribes. To address these technical gaps in tribal capacity in the Northwest and the Great Basin, we designed a project that would provide climate data at the scale of tribal decision-making, that would support tribal staff through the vulnerability assessment process by providing training and technical assistance if they have questions about the process, as well as making the vulnerability assessment process more accessible to tribal staff by developing a curated online collection of available tools, guides, data sets, and approaches. So the scope of work was designed in partnership with the CASC and the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and it involved representatives from tribal organizations affiliated with the CASC and the Great Basin LCC. We formalized this tribal involvement in the project through convening a tribal advisory group that included representatives from tribal associations, Bureau of Indian Affairs, tribal climate networks, as well as Indigenous scholars on climate adaptation. So all of the work of the effort, from its initiation through its completion, was done in partnership with tribes. And this was really key because as project PI and as a team that was primarily comprised of Western scientists who are not tribal members, we couldn't possibly anticipate what resources would be most relevant and culturally appropriate for tribes. Tribes are the experts on tribes. So ensuring the usefulness of this work, it was going to be really necessary that we have intentional, iterative tribal engagement throughout the process. When we started our work, the climate data that had been widely available to tribes was limited primarily to things like average annual temperature and precipitation across reservations. So if you were a tribe and you wanted to know specifically how your tribe might be affected by climate change, what impacts you might be seeing, there are a couple sites where you might be able to look up your reservation and see how these really general things might be changing. But we knew just from our own work with tribes that this information actually isn't that useful to tribal decision making. Tribes are interested in a lot of different kinds of geographic areas, not just reservations, and they're interested in a lot of more downstream impacts, sometimes literally things like stream flow, stream temperatures affecting things like salmon. So we knew that we were going to have to work with tribes to figure out what data would be most useful to them and how to get it to them. And so early on in the project, we delivered a survey to tribes asking which impacts and what types of geographies they were most concerned with. So again, to know what information was going to be most useful, we have to ask the intended user for this project. And what we found was, much like we had assumed, that tribes are in fact concerned about diverse impacts. Highest on the list would be impacts on species or habitats. Next, declining snowpack and glaciers, changes in stream temperature and stream flows, risk of wildfire, drought, flooding, changes in invasive species, pest pathogens, increasing sediment in streams, heavy rain events, ocean acidification, sea level rise, warmer ocean temperature, more extreme events. None of these is mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation. They're also concerned about diverse geographies. Yes, many tribes are concerned about changes on their reservation, but they're also concerned about changes to watersheds of concern for them, ceded areas, usual and accustomed areas, sort of tribally specific kinds of geographies, and then many other that don't fall into any of these sort of broader categories. And most tribes are interested in more than one geography. They're planning across a range of geographies that they use for different purposes. So they might be worried about infrastructure on a reservation, whereas they might be worried about changes in species of first foods across their usual and accustomed area, which is often much larger than a reservation. So we realized that to provide climate data that was going to be useful to tribes, we had to ask each tribe over what specific geographic areas they were making decisions. And so we reached out to all 84 tribes in the Northwest and the Great Basin to ask over what areas they'd like to receive climate data. You know, we didn't go directly to a tribe's natural resources staff or their GIS technician or a tribal community member. We wrote formal letters to every tribal council chairperson for all 84 tribes in the Northwest and Great Basin, notifying them that we would be making this information request of their staff for these geographies. So contacting tribal councils first before engaging with tribal staff or community members was a way of demonstrating respect for tribal sovereignty. It's called going in the front door, and it's a best practice for any engagement with tribes. We then sent another round of letters when we were ready to release the tool, the tribal climate tool that I'll show you in a minute, to confirm with each tribe the geographies that we'd received from them and that it was okay for these geographies to be shared. So because this tool was going to be publicly available, we had to let the tribes know this and be sure not to send any sensitive information they wouldn't want seen by the public. So again, this is called obtaining free, prior, and informed consent, and is also a hallmark of ethical engagement with tribes. So the information we received back from the tribes about the geographies that they were concerned with, again, showed that there was a wide range of geographies and that we couldn't have anticipated these ahead of time using broad categories. We did see lots of interest in knowing impacts across watersheds, from large basins to smaller watersheds or specific areas like Rias here in Washington. We also saw a lot of tribally specific kinds of geographies, like traditional or ancestral territories, treaty areas, usual and accustomed areas. We saw some municipal boundaries, cities, counties, or groups of counties, and then other really unique geographies, like everything west of this line or this valley. And we use that information then to develop and the information on what impacts were of concern to develop a tribal climate tool, which summarizes across those geographies of interest to tribes the impacts or the changes that we're going to see in a variety of climate and climate-related variables that correspond to those impacts of concern. And I'm going to see if I can pull this off live here and show you. Hopefully you're seeing. Did that work out all right? Did you guys see that?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So I thought I would just quickly, and it's kind of, I think, more effective and faster just to show you the tool real quick live. So the Tribal Climate Tool, you arrive and there's a little disclaimer about the areas of interest, and if you're a tribe and you come on here and there's something on here you don't want to see, like you change your mind about sharing a geography, you can always contact us to have it removed. So again, sort of a disclaimer about these not being legally binding boundaries and the ability to change them. You can then select your tribe. I'm going to choose the Makah because then we can see there are coastal tribes, so you get some sea level rise information there. And you can go to the tool or you can take a tour. Again, we work really hard to make this easily used by a broad range of users, from those who may have really advanced technical GIS capacity or climate capacity to maybe a community member who doesn't have any training in this but wants to see what is coming up for their tribe in the future under different scenarios. So you can take a tour, which I'm not going to do right now, that'll walk you through the whole thing and everything that it offers, or you could go straight to the tool, which is what I'm going to do. And when you get to the tool, so up here is, you can pick your tribe again, and you can also pick, we offered up to 3 custom geographies, as well as a reservation for every tribe that has one. And so the Makah has 3 options here. They gave us 2 custom geographies as well as their reservation. I'm going to stick with their usual and accustomed area, which we're seeing outlined here. And you can explore a bunch of climate-related variables, either spatially or through a graph. I'm going to start with the map. And each of these has help buttons all along the way to tell you more information about these. You can, we're looking right now at annual total precipitation. You can also look at seasonal, so maybe I'll just pull up a not so good news of future summer precipitation. You can look in inches or millimeters, choose your units, choose your time period. I'm looking at the end of the century for a higher emission scenario, and you can see over the selected area how spatially that is likely to change. But then we also provide a narrative summary of the change. So reminding you the time period and the higher emission scenario, we expect to see precipitation on average across this area to be this amount, a decrease of this amount from the historical value. You can also see that in a table form. You can also download the data, download the map data. So we tried to provide it in a bunch of different ways that might speak to different kinds of users or learners. You can view that in a graph, and so you can see the model average across time periods and change precipitation. You can also see individual model values if you click on the dots in each each of the time categories. And then you can also, again, see all of that summarized in a table. I'm not going to run through everything offered on the tool, but I did want to show just the range of different kinds of data sets that we have, from sort of continuous raster data to, if you want to look at something like stream flow, we have point data in here because our stream flow projections are based on where stream gauges are available for which this modeling has been done. So the nearest one here, which will give you a sense of what might be going on in this region, is at the Elwha River. You can see the percent change is likely to happen. You can, again, look at it through a graph. We also have line data, so you can look at stream temperature, for example. These are projections from, and one thing that should be clear is that as I move through these, what we were doing was really crosswalking the impacts of concern to the tribes in our region with all of the best available data to match that concern and give them some insight into what might be coming under different scenarios. So for that raster data earlier, like things like changes in precipitation, that's all coming from MACA. This is coming from the Northwest project, looking at projected future changes in stream temperature. That point data on stream flows is coming from SIG's 2860 project. So we were drawing from our knowledge of the best available data for all of these different kinds of impacts to pull it into the tool and then think about how to visualize it in a way that would be most useful to tribes. And so for stream temperature, for example, you can, it's viewed in different categories of warming, and these are important because there's different thresholds for things that might be important to tribes like salmon. And you can highlight, for example, you can click on and off these different categories so that you could pick out the streams, for example, that might be cold water refugia for certain fish. And again, you can see a summary of the change that might be coming over the whole area for the tribe, in addition to looking at the individual streams. So we see the categories of different temperatures of streams changing, the percent streams that fall into those categories changing over time and becoming warmer under different scenarios. And then I might show one more, actually two more really quickly. So vegetation composition, let me go back to the map. This is another way of viewing the data here for using MC2, a process-based model of potential future vegetation. We use a slider here. This is what we found to be the most intuitive way to look at potential changes in vegetation over the area of interest. And you can see here, for example, by scrolling between what's changing from a conifer forest to projected more mixed forest, you can see by changing scenario what a huge difference it makes sticking to a lower emission scenario versus a higher emission scenario, for example. And again, you can look at a table here which summarizes the percent of the area of interest that has different vegetation cover under different time horizons and emission scenarios. And then lastly, I'll just show relative sea level, which is using sort of hot off the presses data that was developed by the Climate Impacts Group and our partners, Sea Grant and NOAA, to get this data that is showing much more likely to be accurate estimates of sea level rise that take into account vertical land motion in the Northwest in Washington, which, for example, out here at Neah Bay, for the most part, it's been rising as fast as sea level rise, if not faster. And so you can see the difference. You would get a very different estimate if you were not taking into account that vertical land motion. And so you can look at potential, you can click on an area and see for the end of the century under high emission scenario, here there's a 50% chance that sea level rise will exceed 1.2 feet versus a 99% chance for that segment that it actually won't rise, that you will exceed 0.3 feet. And then at the highest, if you want to see your risk if you want to really explore that sort of higher tail end of what could happen, there's a 1% chance that it could exceed 3.9 feet. So this is, again, sort of the very latest models are available in this tool that we could gather from across our region. And the another thing the tool can do is it can create a summary report for you. So it can take all of the things that you can explore through the tool, and you can click which ones you want to see, which variables you want to see, what units you want to see it in, for what time periods and emission scenario. I'm just going to leave them all selected, and you can download a report that summarizes all of this for your area. And so you can have this handy PDF if you just want to go in and get the numbers that you're going to put into a report for an assessment. And so I'm going to leave the tool then for a minute, hopefully. Let's see, and go back to the presentation. So those geographies, getting those geographies and the impacts of concern to tribes was key to delivering information that would be really relevant to the tribe's decision making. To get so much closer than looking at just change in mean annual temperature and precipitation for a reservation. Now the tribes can see changes in variables that are much closer to the things that are really of concern for them over the areas that are of concern from them. And it takes the additional step of summarizing that information. So what is the overall change over the area that you care about under different scenarios? And this is the kind of information that we are often at the Climate Impacts Group approached to do for counties, for cities, for parks, for all kinds of entities. And typically an entity would have to contract with the university to get this kind of information for some fee that could be tens of thousands of dollars. And we've now made this information available for free for every tribe in the Northwest and Great Basin, so that they can better leverage the resources they have towards an assessment instead of getting this data to begin with. So we were really pleased with how this turned out and also its reception. But we also wanted to make sure that we weren't just, and I'll say one more thing before I move on from the tool, which is that in addition to getting to working with tribes to figure out what kind of information they wanted in the tool and over what areas, we did a lot of user testing to make sure that the visualizations were working for them, that the tool was intuitive for its use. And we did user testing with a bunch of different tribes and a bunch of different kinds of users, from really technically advanced folks to folks with very little experience working with climate data, to make sure that this was working for folks with a broad range of experience with this kind of information. And that was, I cannot tell you how much this tool changed from when we started to when we finished based on that user testing. And so to make the information easier to use, iterative user testing and feedback, and we did this sort of at, every few weeks we would do a different round of testing, and that was really key to getting this to a place where folks found it helpful and useful and intuitive. And then the other thing I want to say is that producing the tool on its own really wasn't enough. So another resource we provided as part of this work was a Tribal Climate Technical Support Desk to provide rapid response to questions about our project products, and then just the vulnerability assessment process more generally. So any tribal staff or community member or partner could call, and that's me, and it's just my phone, although it's actually usually my cell phone. They could call if they have any questions about the vulnerability assessment process, about climate data, about anything that is relevant to their work in preparing for climate change. We received calls. I actually need to update my numbers. I want to say it's probably something around 12 to 15 tribes in Northwest and Great Basin, but a lot of those tribes have called more than once, and they have called from throughout the region. And the calls that we received were very informative for guiding our work. They ranged from, I have been working in construction all my life. I am now the environmental director of my small tribe, and I don't know anything about climate change, but I know it's really important. Where do I get started? To our tribe is monitoring snowpack. What kind of data logger should we be using? to I have a vulnerability assessment due next month. Here's what I've done so far. What do I need to do next to get this over the finish line? To we're developing salmon habitat models. We would like to find the latest fire risk data to incorporate into our model. Where do we get this? So the questions were just all over the map in terms of where people were in their process, their technical capacity, the kinds of resources that they needed. And so the questions that we received on the help desk was helpful on its own for those who were calling, but it was also incredibly helpful for us for guiding the resources that we were providing. And that support was really key to getting people to use eventually when the tool came out, that offering that support, that help desk to help people use the tool has been incredibly important as well. But the questions along the way were also really important for guiding the development of the tool, and also a website that we developed, the Tribal Vulnerability Assessment Resources website. The website, I'm going to actually switch one more time here and take you to the website. There we go. Okay, this is easier to just go right there. So the website that we developed offered, again, we were trying to provide a curated online collection of available tools, guides, data sets, and approaches for vulnerability assessment geared toward tribal staff and community members. There are a lot of resources out there, and it can be really overwhelming for folks to figure out where to get started, sort of like drinking from the fire hose, and we wanted to provide the water fountain. So the sort of an orientation to the things that are out there, just a few key examples and key questions to get people started. And we designed the website based on the questions that we got from the help desk and the kinds of questions that we get in our work with tribes. So again, starting for that person who's just getting started and just wants to know, like, how is the climate expected to change? Why does this matter for tribes? And if you go, and then there's a couple sort of orienting questions below this, like how is the climate changing and why? Why does it matter for tribes? How is the climate going to change for my tribe? And in any one of these, if you go in to the box, we have tried to provide everything from sort of the Climate 101. So you could do a little intro to climate science, and we have videos available from the National Climate Assessment and elsewhere to help, these are just 3-minute videos to just get you started. So you really want to take the deep dive, you can go into the National Climate Assessment, Climate Science Supplement. We have some, frequently asked questions on climate change, science, and then, the really deep dive if you want to go into it. So we tried to really just curate this for folks so they could start wherever it was that they were in their process, to maybe they want to look at climate impacts by sector or by region. And we did this for each of these key questions that we were receiving. And so for how will climate change for my tribe, you can get to the Tribal Climate Tool that I just showed you if you're in our region. And again, this was designed for the Northwest and Great Basin. But there's also other tools out there. So we offer, you can go to Climate Explorer or CalAdapt or Climate Mapper, and then lots of other resources through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. A lot of other tribes are interested in how can they assess their climate vulnerability. The tool provides that exposure information, but then what do you do next? And so some tribes are really interested in taking a very indigenous approach. Some may want to use a purely Western science-based approach, and others may want to combine approaches. Depending on what they want to do, we provide a few key resources like guidebooks to provide, again, like a guide for how they could do these kinds of approaches, and then some key resources. This is a database of tons of different examples of tribal assessments, a video on how to combine these two sources of information, how to combine Western science with indigenous knowledge to do this kind of work, and then examples from tribes who have done this. Many tribes also would like to engage their communities, their youth, and their governments in assessment. We provide resources and examples for doing that, and also resources and examples for how to use, fund, and get support for tribal climate change vulnerability assessment efforts. So this website, again, not every tribe is going to want to give a call to the help desk and really as I was providing resources to folks from the help desk, this is really an online help desk for folks that has a lot of what I would have given them anyway, and it sort of can be a one-stop shop to get them started and oriented from wherever they are in the process, and then they can go on to more specific resources elsewhere. And then again, we didn't want to just have this tool and this website and then the help desk. We're really trying to provide, come at this from a lot of different angles, and so we also wanted to make sure that we were providing training through workshops and webinars. So we went to different areas of the Great Basin in the Northwest, so Nevada and Eastern Oregon and the Puget Sound region, and invited the tribal government and staff and community members from those regions to come to workshops and bring their laptops, and we would sit down and sort of provide an orientation to vulnerability assessment and also hands-on training on these tools. Because what we have found is that even if you make the tools really easy to use, even if you broadcast their availability, there's still this barrier to actually engaging with these things until people sit down and get their hands on them and start working with them. And that initial barrier, that intimidation factor, it's so helpful to offer this kind of hands-on training just to get people feeling comfortable using it and familiar with it. And then they can share that with other staff or community members in their tribe. So we also made sure to include funding in our grant to support tribes to come to these workshops. So we, ahead of time, had money set aside to support tribal staff and community members to travel to these workshops. And we made sure, again, to go to them to make participation easier. We didn't have them all in Seattle. And we encouraged cohorts, so 2 to 3 participants per tribe, so they could have a team within their tribe working on this. We had lots of small group work to encourage network building, so it wasn't just me talking the whole time. And we also brought the tool developer, Catherine Hegovich from Idaho, to the meetings to get more feedback on the tool, and so we could get more feedback on the website. And then we, again, did another iteration of fine-tuning based on what we saw from folks in the workshops and the questions that they asked. And so the key here was that we were making sure to not just deliver these resources, but to take additional steps to build capacity through training and through encouraging the development of communities of practice so that tribes could meet other folks nearby who are doing similar work and develop teams within their own tribes where that wasn't present. And then the last thing I wanted to note was that we were really pleased with the success of this work. The whole team, the university, federal, and tribal partners, were all really pleased with where this turned out. We wanted to share the story of the success of this effort. And the thing I wanted to make sure to communicate was that before ever even talking to UW News, our University of Washington press folks, about crafting a press release, we first had to make sure to ask our tribal partners if this attention would be welcome and think carefully about how to craft a story that would serve the tribes, that would draw attention to climate impacts faced by tribes, that would emphasize their leadership and responding, and use our experience as an example of successful partnership among tribes, federal institutions, and universities. And so to do this, to center the tribes in the narrative and have them tell their own story, we developed a shared press release. It wasn't just UW releasing this. We released it with affiliated tribes with Northwest Indians and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and one of our tribal partners, the Makah tribe, and made sure that they were listed as contacts as well if there was further questions. And then we had, there's been a bunch of stories that have come out that have highlighted this effort. And in all of these, I feel really good about the fact that all of these stories are really centered on the tribes and tell the story from the tribal perspective and how this work helps support their good work. And so again, one of the sort of key principles in doing this work in partnership with tribes in an ethical and effective way was to center the tribes in our project communications. And then one last thing I wanted to note is that the funding for this work ended last winter, but the Tribal Technical Support Desk remains open. So I still get calls, I still get emails, and I'm happy to answer them. And again, a key thing that I've found in working with tribes, and I think this is really true for most partnerships, particularly with tribes and communities, is to commit to sustained partner relationships. So the relationships don't end when the project ends. I'm fortunate that I have some funding that can help cover that time, and it's not a huge amount of time, but just making sure that non-tribal partners don't disappear when the projects end. This is really important for maintaining trust in our institutions and in us individually in this work. So project products and outcomes. Again, we have produced this climate data and resources that's tailored to the needs and the capacities of Northwest and Great Basin tribes. We have resulted in some enhanced tribal capacity and communities of practice for climate change vulnerability assessment. We did, and I say that with some confidence because we built evaluation into our work. And so, for example, evaluations from our workshops, we know that folks left feeling like they had a better handle on climate impacts and working with climate data, and that they felt that they had developed their networks among different tribes and within their own tribes in doing this work. And we're also working on developing scholarship aimed at informing co-production of actionable climate science. So I'm working on a paper right now on bridging the divide between available and desired climate resources for tribes and other communities, as well as lessons learned from the Climate Help Desk. There's a lot of interest in climate hotlines. Would they be used? Would they be effective? And so we have some experience now with that and can tell some stories there and lessons learned. And then we also have this very different footprint on the landscape than if you were going to look at climate impacts on tribes based just on reservations, for example. You would get a very different answer than if you looked at the impacts on the lands that tribes have identified for themselves as being important to them into the future. And so there's opportunity there to take a more realistic look at the kinds of impacts of concern to tribes over the areas of concern to tribes. And just one last note on sort of summarizing the practices that we tried to take through this work to ethically and effectively co-produce this work with tribes. And I'm going to, this is repeating the things that I highlighted throughout the talk, and I would just say that these are specific tribes, and yet I think a lot of these would stand for any kind of partnership with any community. And one is intentional, iterative engagement throughout the project. Respecting tribal sovereignty and using tribal information ethically, making sure to, as part of a project, build capacity in communities of practice, as well as just supplying products and tools, making sure folks have, you've helped build that expertise to use that tool or those resources, and also networks for folks to rely on as they engage with those resources. And centering tribes in project communications, and that could be true for any partner, but really making sure that it's that the success is shared and it serves the communities that were really the focus of this effort. And finally, committing to sustained relationships. So making sure that when the project ends, we don't disappear, but we stay engaged to help maintain that trust and continue serving that community and that relationship. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the presentation, Mead. I got a quick question for you, Mead. So, looks like a pretty cool system you got developed there. Are there any plans to expand this to like other regions or locations or anything like that? Have you talked to any other tribes or anything like that to work with them?
Yeah, this is an ongoing conversation. There's been, I get contacted by tribes from outside of the Northwest and Great Basin asking, is this available for them? Do I know of a resource like this that's available for them? And we've been talking to a bunch of different potential partners on how to expand this. I think there's definitely interest, and it's just a matter of what the right partnership would look like to make something like this happen in other regions, and the timing and funding and the usual considerations. So it's in discussion. I'll leave it at that.
Ian says, great presentation. Matt also said a great presentation. Is the data also organized on a watershed scale?
So It's not, we didn't do any of this for sort of common categories or buckets of geographies across the entire scale of the Northwestern Great Basin. They were done specifically for each tribe. And so for many tribes, they did request a watershed or these 3 watersheds, but they're all at different scales. And one of the reasons that we didn't do it for like all watersheds, for example, in the Northwestern Great Basin, I believe it's the USGS that already has a tool that does provide a number of climate variables at the HUC level. I can't remember which HUCs it is. It might be for a range of nested HUC scales, but so we didn't want to repeat something that had already been done, and then we also thought it would be sort of potentially more overwhelming, like less accessible than just, pick your tribe and pick the region that you gave us if we just had a whole thing for watersheds. So we didn't do it for all watersheds in the Northwest. And it also would have been a question of like, at what scale, like, HUC 12s or 8s or 6s, and it just was going to be a lot of data to handle, a lot of work, and maybe not necessarily that much easier for tribes to use than just giving them what they actually wanted for each tribe. So that's a long answer of saying no, we didn't do it for all watersheds across the Northwest or Great Basin.
Okay, thank you for answering that now. So with that, I will just say thank you again, Mead, and thank you, Elda, for your support in this webinar series, and thank you everyone who participated. And, looks like we got one quick question. How can we integrate with other USGS climate adaptation science centers? That's a good question, actually.
I would love more specificity on that question.
Yeah. So this is with the, I guess, the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and working with Althea Walker, who's the tribal liaison there.
Yeah, we explored the idea of expanding the tool through the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, and it just wasn't going to work logistically for a number of reasons, at least not at this time, but maybe in the future. And I had talked to Althea about this, and there is interest in expanding this through that. It's just a matter of capacity and timing, and so that may or may not happen through the CAST network. It may happen. I'm talking to some other folks that are also interested in doing this in ways that could bring in the CAST network, but just not rely primarily on the CAST network to get this done. So there's a lot of interest, but again, it's logistically challenging to take exactly what we did and ramp it up to the whole U.S. through the network. So we'll see.
Okay, very cool. Well, with that, like I said, I'll call it a day, and thank you everyone for your participation. So thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.